Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Laveau. Ukraine wedged in the middle. The political establishment in Kiev has made it clear it wants membership in some of the West's most elitist clubs, like NATO and the EU. Clearly a turn away from Russia. The question is, does the West really care? To Crosstalk Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Geoffrey Roberts, with me here in the studio. He's a professor of history at University College Cork. Also in Moscow, we have Mark Sloboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst. And in London, we cross to Jonathan Steele. He's an international affairs commentator for The Guardian. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Jonathan, if we can go to you first in London, it's really quite curious. I saw a picture yesterday, a U.S. flag over Ukrainian security service building. Is this the extent of Kiev's integration into the West, at least to date?
Well, it certainly is a symbolically interesting move. I mean, the West has been trying to, at least certain people in the West, I don't think it's a unilateral decision by everybody, but they want to get Ukraine into NATO, and getting them into the EU is the first step into getting them into NATO. This has been a long-standing goal for at least 10 years by people in the Pentagon and the United States administration.
Okay, Geoffrey, I think it's very interesting because we've heard President Poroshenko say that he wants Ukraine in NATO. He certainly wants Ukraine in the European Union. He's got the CIA in Kiev, we know that, maybe members from the Pentagon, and maybe even some boots on the ground. But does the West really want to have Ukraine in NATO, in the European Union?
Actually, I'm inclined to say that Ukraine is already in NATO. I mean, NATO is a political as well as a military alliance, and politically there's no doubt that Ukraine is aligned with NATO. There was a meeting of the, what they call the NATO-Ukraine Commission recently. They put out a statement basically attacking Russia. From that statement, you'd never guessed that Ukraine wasn't already a member of NATO. So I think politically, you know, Ukraine is already a member of NATO. And of course,
absolutely. With my military background, having actual NATO awards and ribbons on my chest, I have to agree. NATO is entirely a political organization. In fact, militarily, they're somewhat of a over-exaggeration, a little bit of a paper tiger, but they are very much a political organization. And what we will see with Ukraine, what we are already seeing, is Ukraine will be a member of NATO in every way that matters, except for name. It will be, Ukraine, for all intents and purposes, already is a de facto member. We have seen NATO military exercises in the Ukraine in the midst of an ongoing civil war in the country with the regime that came to power in February.
Okay, but Jonathan, this is not NATO membership for Ukraine because the West wants to protect Ukraine. This is a different strategy, and that strategy is directed against Russia. It has nothing to do with Ukraine, actually.
Well, it's part of the extension of US power across the world, really, and now into areas that they weren't able to reach before, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It started, of course, with the former members of the Warsaw Pact, Hungary and Czech Republic, Slovakia and Poland, and then it moved to the Baltic states, and then they wanted to move it to Bulgaria and Romania, and now they want to move it, of course, to Georgia, which they tried in 2008, and now to Ukraine. So it's just a continuation of the policy that's been going on for about 15 years.
Okay, but Geoffrey, this is very, very dangerous because Ukraine isn't in NATO, but if it's going to behave that way, it becomes a really heightened security risk. Russia is not going to change its course in vis-a-vis Ukraine just because Mr. Poroshenko wants to play house with Brussels.
I'm not sure that Russia's got any choice. I mean, I think in effect, Ukraine is lost to Russia as far as its alignment with the West.
What is Ukraine now?
Well, obviously, we're talking about a truncated Ukraine, but the point about this truncated Ukraine, now that the Crimea is gone, now that parts of eastern Ukraine are in effect split away, you have you know, what's left is inevitably, in a political sense, going to be a very pro-Western political entity. And that does mean NATO membership, that does mean EU integration. No, I think that's going to take a long time, and I'm not sure that the West is actually prepared to pay the price for Ukraine becoming a member of NATO and the EU. continue, but we'll see what
But
happens.
I mean, if I can go to Mark here, I mean, they can be a shadow member of Ukraine, but that doesn't speak very much about the European Union. In this sense, there is a divergence.
Yeah, I mean, the pattern up till now has always been that a country joins NATO first. And then the European Union. And this has been an established pattern as both institutions have moved east across Europe up to the Russian borders. In this case, because of the obvious disagreement within the country, as well as the objections of Russia, the reverse has been attempted this time. And when the legitimate democratically a government was forced to say no to the EU association agreement because of the extremely heinous neoliberal terms of this agreement, we saw what was, without a doubt, a open Western support for regime change in the country and the overthrow of the constitutional order. And you would have to be incredibly naive to believe that NATO, and not paying attention to their own statements, to believe that NATO is not following right after and to cement this consolidation of Ukraine into the West.
But Russia is moving towards NATO. That's what we heard a few weeks ago. I think it was a very humorous YouTube video that we saw here with the State Department and I think it was an admiral, which again, you know, this is calculation here. Jonathan, yeah, go ahead, because I just can't see how NATO adds any kind of security to the alliance.
Jump in there. You know, as long ago as 1954, the Soviet Union expressed an interest in becoming a member of NATO. Gorbachev talked about a common European home and a common European security structure. Absolutely. The whole policy after the fall of the Soviet Union, the policy of Russia was a policy of security integration in Europe, including some kind of NATO membership for Russia. I mean, and in a way, that's the part of the problem, is the failure to integrate Russia into pan-European collective security structures. That within that context, then the whole Ukrainian situation would have had a very different trajectory. And so I agree. Now, the idea of NATO moving close, of Russia moving closer to NATO is a ridiculous one. But historically, it's been very much on the agenda, at least on the agenda of the Soviet Union and on the agenda of the Russian Federation.
Jonathan, I'm going to go back to you in London. We did in the first years of Putin's presidency, his first 2 terms. I remember very, very clearly, and then we had the presidency of Mr. Medvedev, of talking about a new European security structure. But the U.S. simply has no interest in it whatsoever because it would demand more equality among partners. That's something Washington doesn't want to hear.
Well, I absolutely agree with you, and I agree with what Jeffrey Roberts has just said. I mean, the whole thing is Russia has always been trying to integrate with the West since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's been the West that's been rejecting it and trying to isolate Russia or keep them out or for various reasons, and one of them is the one that you said, that they don't want any kind of equivalent power in Europe to the United States. Washington doesn't want that. But you know, President Putin in his speech the other day, his State of the Nation speech, made it very clear that he wanted to have good relations with the West. He's not interested in self-isolation or estrangement. He wants just to get the world to recognize that Russia is strong and independent, but is obviously keen on making good cooperation with the rest of the world, including the United States and Western Europe.
Jonathan, if I can stay with you in London, apparently you actually read the speech, because I have read many accounts of that speech in Western media, particularly in the United States. I didn't get that message whatsoever from their coverage of it. Why is that?
Well, I think people were looking for something on Ukraine, and they wanted to look for things that would reinforce their view that Russia is an aggressive country, that it's trying to expand across Europe, that it has hostile intent to its neighbors and all that kind of thing. And they didn't find much of that in the speech. And so they didn't cover it, you know, what he actually said, because he didn't say what they hoped he would say.
Mark, if I can go to you, but I think they did say that. They did say all of these aggressive things. I didn't see it in the speech at all. I was in Valdai. I listened to the speech in person. I didn't see the aggressive behavior, intense whatsoever, but that's what's reported.
Well, I mean, for the Western mainstream media and governments, I mean, anything will be reported as Russian aggression at this point. I mean, if you are not rabidly anti-Russian, then you are pro-Russian. And the Western media, of course, can't allow that. It doesn't fit the narrative that's being told. As for NATO's continued encroachment, the purpose of NATO as an institutional, built into its institutional structures and its mindset from the Cold War continues now. The purpose of NATO is to keep the U.S. in Europe, to keep Germany down, and to keep Russia out of Europe. That hasn't changed. This is why Russia has always requested for an integrated security between Europe and Russia that moves beyond NATO, that finally leaves the Cold War behind. This has continually been rejected. The U.S. does not want Russia drawing any closer to Europe. They see that as interfering with their geopolitical control, their hegemony of not only the Eurasian continent, but the world. They will not allow Russia to grow closer to Europe. And,
so, Jeff, so this is it, right? That this is what this whole Ukraine expedition is all about, is to keep Russia away from Europe.
I mean, in response to Mark, I think there were opportunities to integrate Russia into a new security architecture in Europe in the 1990s, and indeed again after the 9/11, when there was a significant improvement in Russian-American relations, and it's the failure of those opportunities to be exploited that's led to the present situation we're in now, at least partly. I personally wouldn't rule out a change in Western policy and a change in Russian-Western or Russian-American relations in the future. If we actually sort of keep saying, oh, well, you know that's it, that's what NATO is, that's what the Americans want, that's the Western position, there's no way forward, is there?
Well,
it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay, on that point, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing whether the West really cares about Ukraine. Okay, I'd like to go back to Jonathan in London. Just as I said, coming back into the program here, does the West actually really care about Ukraine? We've discussed on this program, I've discussed ad nauseum on this program over the last year, how much there are members of, let's say, the neocon clan in Washington and in some elements in Europe want to alienate Russia. That's their intention here. But what do they really think about Ukraine? Because the costs are mounting and the suffering is mounting in Ukraine.
No, well, I don't think they do care about Ukraine. I think it's just a strategy of denial. They want to deny Ukraine to Russia. And what actually happens internally within Ukraine and how people are living and whether there's any reform of the economy and whether the oligarchs are going to reduce their power, all these issues, and what the language structure will be, whether Russian will remain an official language, all these things are not even secondary, they're tertiary to the big issue, which for the West, neocons, is to, as I say, keep Russia out of Ukraine. And, you know, they're not interested in the daily life of ordinary people at all.
Okay, Mark, can you have family members in Ukraine?
Yeah, and the situation in Donbass is simply, at this point, inhumane. It's intolerable. There are reports of villages under siege that are still being shelled every day in the Lugansk region, where people are now being rationed bread at 250 grams a day, which is it's exactly double what the worst conditions were during the fascist siege of Leningrad in World War II. And that's how people are living through this Christmas season, many of them without heat, without water, without electricity, without food, without medicine, without hospitals. This is the way they are living.
Mark, I see all three of you are agreeing, okay?
Maybe not.
Why don't we see this more in Western media?
Well, I'm not sure I do agree with some of the things you're saying here. I think Western politicians do care about the Ukraine. up to a certain extent. I don't think they care enough to.
They don't want to pay the cost.
I don't think they want to pay the price, and I don't think they care enough to, to transgress their own interests. But and I also think when Western politicians talk about the threat to Russia, when they characterise Putin as challenging the world order, I think they're genuine in those beliefs. I mean, one of the problems.
But how could they possibly be genuine in those beliefs? Because they don't match reality.
Ever since this crisis has begun, I've been going around saying every opportunity you need to understand the point of view of Russia. If you don't understand the point of view of Russia, you won't understand what's going on. But the same applies. Russia needs to understand the point of view of the West. I mean, one of the characteristics of the Cold War, after all, was this kind of complete misapprehension of intentions.
I don't know. I mean,
strategies.
let me go to Jonathan, because I think that this is the difference between the Cold War and today, is that there were people on both sides who tried to put themselves in the shoes of their opponent. I don't see that at all today whatsoever. There is this complete denial of, at least politically speaking, denial that there's human agency in eastern Ukraine, that these people feel threatened by this regime that came to power illegally in February. This is a narrative that the political elite cannot face up to, because if it does, the entire narrative about Ukraine and Russia collapses.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I am shocked and saddened by the fact that in so much of the Western media, news reporting has taken a back seat to kind of ideological, prejudiced attitudes and censoring of themselves and by editors of reporters of what's actually going on. I mean, Mark is completely right. There is terrible human suffering going on in eastern Ukraine. There are hundreds of thousands of refugees. It's hardly covered at all. I mean, we hear what's going on in Syria, we hear what's going on in Yemen, but we hear nothing about eastern Ukraine or the human suffering. Why? Because basically the majority of the civilians who are being killed by Ukrainian forces, not by the anti-Kiev rebels. And that doesn't fit the narrative. The idea is that if Russia's the aggressor, therefore Russia must be doing the majority of the killing. Well, of course it doesn't. That isn't the case. And so, if it's not the case, it can't be reported.
Go ahead,
but Jonathan, there's more than one Western narrative, isn't there? There's more than one story being told in the Western media. And, OK, there is a predominant narrative which reflects government positions and the elite position, but even that narrative is contested by people from within the establishment. I mean, what I've been amazed throughout this crisis is the amount of pushback there's been against, this tirade against Russia and this mischaracterization of what's going on in Ukraine, the extent to which there are alternative sources of information and views. I don't think we should be too pessimistic about that situation.
I agree with you. Okay, Jonathan, I agree with that, because what the next step I wanted to go to is that the Western narrative is cracking. It is breaking up in many respects. I mean, looking at the number of stories coming out here. But then you have, then you have the U.S. State Department, and this is what I think is really interesting, because they remain, they're stonewalling. They will not seriously consider even members of the media questioning the narrative, because it is falling apart.
Well, I mean, I don't think Jeffrey is completely right there. I mean, of course, on social media and in small specialized areas of the media, you will get a different narrative about eastern Ukraine. But in the main broadcasting networks and the big newspapers and so on, it's very, very one-sided and much more ideological than during the Cold War. I mean, in the Cold War, obviously the US and the West was an antagonist of Russia and vice versa. But the language used to talk about Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader at the time, was nothing like as grotesquely rude and humiliating and insulting as the language used about Vladimir Putin today in most of the Western media.
Let's take.
Could I just say I do agree on that point about the demonization of Putin. I think is quite.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Putin's in some ways, but actually when I read some of the stuff that's said about him in the Western press, I want to spring to his defense, believe me.
Okay, it's not only demonization of Putin. We have to look at these few voices in the Western media that have spoken out. Let's take a look at Stephen Cohen, a fabulous, storied professor at Princeton, whom the New York Times in their pages called a villain for his position
John Mearsheimer?
John Mearsheimer, one of the grandfathers of Western international relations theory, has been dismissed as living in an old world because of his. The same thing with Henry Kissinger and so on. These aren't fringe voices, right?
And they're not all paid by Putin.
They weren't fringe voices before, but they have themselves been demonized by a Western media that in lockstep has unleashed a tirade of ad hominem against anyone who breaks from their narrative.
Okay, and the reason is, if I can go to Jonathan, and it's already been talked about by Foreign Minister Lavrov and also by President Putin, is that essentially this is what's going on with Ukraine has nothing to do with Ukraine as far as the West is concerned. It has everything to do with forced regime change in the country that I'm living in, Russia.
Well, no, that is true too. I mean, I think there are people who want to change the regime in Moscow just as they did it in Ukraine, and they want to do it in Belarus as well. Although now they're not so interested in Belarus because Ukraine is a bigger fish if they can get it, and they seem to have got it.
Okay,
I'm sure there are plenty of people in the West who'd like to go back to the situation we had in the 1990s, where you had a weak Russia, weak state, weak presidency. But I think there's more sensible elements. See, the problem with regime change in Russia, getting rid of Putin, is who comes after Putin. It could be a lot worse. I think the predominant view would probably be, we're better to deal with the devil we know than with devil we know. So I don't go along this line that there's some kind of Western strategy of a regime change in Russia, which of course would be an absolutely ridiculous policy at the present time, when Putin's ratings are through the roof.
Well, one of the interesting things, and Mark, because we live here, we meet each other quite often, and we've commented that that Putin is very much a moderate.
Yeah.
He's very much a moderate, because there are
Absolutely.
certainly voices that would be that during this crisis during Ukraine that said that Putin hasn't done enough, and that's really the biggest question I've always asked on this program. Is Putin doing too little, or is he doing too much? Go ahead, Mark.
That's a very important point. I think I only wish people in the State Department, in the CIA, were as thoughtful as Jeffrey Roberts. I'm afraid that regime change in Russia is very much definitely on their agenda. I don't think there's any question about it. It has been for a long time, and those will only be exaggerated. Those will only become greater over time with this recent anti-Russian resolution that deliberately called for the production of news in Russian aimed at discountering. But I think very much Putin is actually far more lovable than large numbers, if not the majority, of the Russian people. He has become under intense domestic pressure and criticism at home, I think entirely valid, that he has not done far enough. If we take a look at the situation and the people in the Donbass are living in, which we've already described, huddled in the dark in their basements, rationing bread. At the same time, today, Russia started again the supply of coal, gas, and electricity to the regime in Kiev. Things that the people in the Donbass don't have.
Okay, let me go to Jonathan here, because this is what so many voices, opinions, and particularly neocons really want in the West, is they want to provoke Russia into more activist behavior in Ukraine, and this is something that is a red line, and the Russians are not taking the bait. That infuriates them.
Well, I think the big issue actually at the moment in Kiev is whether or not to abandon the peace agreement of Minsk of September, which of course has been violated in various ways by both sides, whether to abandon it totally and restart a big military offensive. I mean, some people like Yatsenyuk have called for that, and Poroshenko, I think, is holding it back at the moment, but there is a big debate going on. I think Western European leaders are trying to prevent that happening, so there is some effort by the West. I'm not sure about the US position, but certainly people like Merkel and so on do not want to see a revival of military activity on a full-out scale in eastern Ukraine. So that's the big issue at the moment. It's not whether Russia's going to take any initiatives, it's whether Kiev is.
Yeah, I'd like to agree with you.
10 seconds, go ahead.
The thing that worries me most about Ukraine is not that the West is interfering and it's controlling the situation. Is that it's actually not controlling the situation, and that the local politicians actually might get their way, and some kind of adventurous actions are possible.
We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Moscow and in London, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, stock rules.
I love you.